Welcome everyone to tonight's Michigan State University Beekeeping Office Hour webinar. So I'm here with Dr. Megan Milbrath, Dr. Zachary Wong, Dan Wines, and our guest presenter, Sam Wolf. So this is an MSU Extension program, and we try to be open to everyone. I'm going to get us started with some announcements. Then Sam is going to talk about a program called AgraAbility. And then Zach will talk about plants in bloom. Dan's going to talk about robbing. I'll talk about winter hive configurations. Megan will talk about winter bees. We'll talk about varroa, and then we'll answer your beekeeping questions. So to get us started with announcements, we posted some resources related to tonight's webinar on our webinar page. So you can use this QR code or the link at the top, and that's where you'll find resources compiled. We also compile a lot of resources on keeping bees in Michigan on this webpage, Getting Started with Beekeeping in Michigan. So if you are thinking about getting started with beekeeping, or if you're a new beekeeper and want to know all the places where you can learn more, this is a good list of things and resources. We list upcoming events on our website. So if you go to pollinators.msu.edu, you can find the events page. Dr. Zachary Wong is instructing a honeybee anatomy and dissection workshop on Saturday, July 27th at 10 a.m. on campus. There is registration for that. So if you are interested in learning from an expert about how to dissect honeybees and want to learn more about their anatomy, this is a great opportunity. All right, I also wanted to highlight that the Center of Michigan Beekeepers Association, or COMB, is hosting Dr. Reed Johnson at their upcoming meeting on Monday, August 12th at 6:30 p.m. on MSU campus at the Pavilion. So Dr. Reed Johnson's a colleague who does a ton of research on the effects of pesticides and agriculture on bees, as well as many other topics, and he'd be a really good person to listen to if you're in the area. Another upcoming event is the MSU Bee Palooza, which will be on Sunday, August 18th at 1 p.m. To 4 p.m. and that's on campus at the Horticulture Gardens. And this is really just kind of a family or any one event where you can learn more about bees and pollinators, and there's a large focus on wild species of bees. I've also been asked to share the Heartland Apicultural Society's Beekeeping Conference. So Michigan is part of the Heartland Apicultural Society's area, and they are hosting their conference in Worcester, Ohio, and on August 23rd and 24th. All right, and then it's not too late to save the date for the Michigan Beekeepers Association's Fall Conference on Saturday, October 19th at Benzie Central High School. So that'll be a nice program and focusing on beekeeping here in Michigan. All right, our next webinar is going to be on Monday, August 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So we hope you join us then. And we are posting recordings to our YouTube channel. So you can find the recording on the video page or the YouTube channel. It just takes us a few days after we present to be able to add closed captions and upload videos. All right, hopefully you're all signed up for our newsletter digest, but if you're not, you can stay up to date by going to our website, clicking Stay Connected, and then selecting the Pollinators and Pollination News Digest. So this is really our main way of communicating with beekeepers and anyone interested in pollinators about upcoming events and new resources. And then finally, I know a lot of you use this resource. We have the Ask Extension form. So if you have questions for our team in between webinars, the best way to ask them is through the Ask Extension form. You go to our website and then click questions, and you'll find the Ask Extension form where you can type out your questions, upload photos, and get an answer. All right, and then we are also still doing a fundraising campaign. So if you know anyone who wants to contribute to beekeeping and pollinator extension work here at MSU, feel free to send them our way. So Sam is here from AgraAbility. And just a reminder to you all that we're having guest people from MSU or MSU Extension share programs or resources that may be of interest to beekeepers here in Michigan. So Sam, I'll let you talk about AgraAbility.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I wonder if, and I wish there was a reaction tool on here right now, whether folks have heard of AgraAbility, because I think that it does seem I've learned a lot about beekeeping in the last few months since I started, and it seems like there's a lot of crossover because there's so much lifting and ergonomics that go into beekeeping. So I'm excited to learn more about beekeeping as I continue in this role and to share a little bit more about AgraAbility with you. So AgraAbility is a USDA funded program that exists in about 21 states, and sometimes that varies which states. But we have a competitive grant that is held by MSU and kind of executed by MSU and Easter Seals MORC, which is Michigan's disability kind of network. And the mission of AgraAbility is to help people keep working in spite of an illness or an injury or a chronic aging condition, really any type of illness or injury that you may have or be starting to experience anything goes. So there's a list there of different things that are common conditions we work with. For some folks, there might be a traumatic injury that occurs, or for others, it might just be realizing that arthritis is starting to impact your work. So that's a very common one that we're visiting with farmers and seeing how can we help make things easier for you. We also work with all scales and types of farms, so it doesn't have to be beekeepers necessarily, and you can have anything from a few hives as long as you have a commercial business, all the way up to, big scale. So AgraAbility starts with a farm visit, and we will have a farm assistive technology professional. His name is Ned. You may have heard of him. Come out to the farm and do an assessment with you and learn about pain points, your operation, the things that might be able to be simple adjustments to make things a little bit more efficient for you. And then he will have a write-up and come back with suggestions of different things that we might do. Now, I realized after I did it in this slide that neither of these pictures necessarily apply to beekeeping, but they are some examples of the assistive technologies that we might be able to help install or help you obtain. So different things, and a particular beekeeping one that I know we've worked on before is a hive lifter. So that can help you with repetitive back motion and lifting. And it can be a motorized situation so that it makes it a little bit easier. And we work with the mechanical engineering department at MSU every spring. And this past year, they made a swarm trap lifter, which was really exciting. I went to the presentation at the end of the term, and it was very practical. And we have designs now so that we can recreate that trap lifter. And they made it just so that it barely fit through the door in the engineering building. So that was really, really neat. So there's some various different things that we do and different scales, but we would be happy if you have any of these conditions that are listed here or anything else, or if this just sounds like it's of interest or you want to hear some more about it, I would be happy to talk with you. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'll be on for a few minutes afterwards. Otherwise, I think my email will be provided too, maybe after this. I didn't think to put that on the slide, but thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, and Sam, you're welcome to put your email in the chat. You can send that to everyone. And for everyone listening, if you have questions now for Sam, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will monitor it, and Sam will respond and maybe type answers there if you have questions. Otherwise, if you have questions after this webinar, you can get in touch with Sam. Thanks a lot. All right. So next up is Zach, and he's going to talk about plants in bloom.
Yeah, so I have a website, bees.msu.edu. If you click on flowers, you'll be able to see this screen here. And actually, it's been updated recently for the summer flowers. So I'm going to go over what's blooming right now, and almost half of them are about the same as last month, of course. Next slide. Do I have control? So the Dutch white clover is still going strong. I just mowed my lawn yesterday. I wait for 2 weeks, so that's enough time for the white clover to finish bloom and almost seed in. If I mow every week, I think bees don't maximize the production, I feel. And the right side is outside clover. I think that's also blooming. I didn't check. There's only one spot near the strawberry fields at MSU that has it. So, But I assume that's blooming because I saw white clover and red clover still both going strong. Okay, next. And the sweet clovers, both white and yellow, are still going. I think they will bloom most of the summer. I drove to the honey festival on the way. I can see those guys blooming, and bees also love them. Good honey plants. But some states are trying to get rid of them. Uh, red clover is also, I saw large fields of red clover planted on the way to the honey festival this weekend. So there people grow them for probably for cows and for animal feed, I think. Or they could be just growing it for as a nitrogen fixer. But it's good for bees if they don't mow it during the bloom period. Next one. Crown wedge is still blooming also. It's not a super good crop for attracting honeybees, but I see more bumblebees actually, maybe because flowers are a little bit too deep for our honeybees. But bees do go to this flower, and again, it blooms most of the summer and still going. And birchwood trefoil, another legume. I saw tons of them on my drive there again. So this one again is going to bloom most of the summer. Very attractive to honeybees. Probably provides both pollen and the nectar to our bees. And regular milkweed, of course, blooms if the different plants have different bloom seasons. So if they bloomed early a month ago, those plants are probably down, but other plants who bloom later will come on. So I see in my front yard, I see them still blooming. Chicory, they have been blooming for a while and they're still going strong. Bees do forage on them, but probably not super attractive. If bees have other plants to go for, they probably tend to ignore this plant maybe until late September or October when all the flowers are gone and bees will concentrate on the chicory. They just grow on the roadsides, like when nothing else grows on sandy and poor soil. This plant will be there, like by the roadside. I couldn't find my picture of these foraging on small leaf plantain, but they do forage for the pollen, even though it's probably wind pollinated. Uh, I took pictures of them probably around 205, 206. Around the old bee lab, bees were foraging on them. Probably, I would say in late August or September when nothing else is going, bees will forage. I'm not sure how good the pollen are as a nutrition for bees, but bees will go for it. I couldn't find my pictures on my hard drive. I have so many photos. From now on, I tried to label them, the plant, the flower names, so I could find them. But if you don't label them, there's no image search for Windows. So I'm out of luck. Next one. So I did take pictures yesterday of bees foraging on the wild carrots. Another name is Queen Anne's lace. I saw a big patch just around Mount Pleasant and the Okemos Road, and I waited there, and I saw honeybees and bumblebees and wasps. So it probably has okay nectar and also pollen. I just didn't have time to download my photo with a watermark with a bee on it for this slide. Next one. So then yesterday I was visiting the community garden, LA garden, and I saw bees foraging. I thought it was a different species from this one. Oh, no, this is Virginia creeper. This is also invitaceae. This one was blooming 2 weeks ago when I was preparing the slides. And 1 year, maybe 3 years ago, I saw tons of bees. And I said, I'll come back next day with my camera. I went back next day, same time, like 5 o'clock, nothing. So I learned my lesson. You have to go back to get a camera right away. So I took this right side picture of the Virginia creeper producing seeds, and others are still blooming right now. So there's different plants have different blooming period. They probably last a while. Next one. And I saw Canada thistle. This was when I was preparing for the slides about a week ago. And right now I drive through. I think most this plant is done. Just have a lot of fluffy white seeds, very ugly when producing seeds. So that's probably almost done. But I do see some are still blooming, but maybe 10% left. When it's going strong, a lot of honeybees on this flower. Very good nectar plant. Next one, I have a fuzzy one with my cell phone. There was a bee on it. You can hardly see it, but that was at MSU 2 weeks ago. So bees, probably bumblebees come to this flower more often, butterflies, than honeybees. A little bit deeper compared to the other one because they're bigger flowers. So not as important for honeybees, but bees do forage on them. Next one. I didn't get a bee picture for this on this bee balm. So there's a red one that's often planted, and this one is almost naturalized. It's grown by the roadside, and it's actually two different species. In the same genus, Malada, this one is Virtuosa. The red one is a different species. So I didn't know that. I thought they were both bee balm. But I did get a picture from the Dow Gardens. I went after the Honey Festival, I went to Dow Gardens and managed to get one bee photo on this plant, this color, the purplish bee balm. Next one. And then 2 weeks ago, when I was trying to prepare the slides for this one, I was saying I need to know what's blooming. Then I realized I didn't have pictures of bees on this teasels. And there was a patch near my house. I went there 2 or 3 times, no bees. So then I said, maybe I need to find a larger patch. So then a week ago, last weekend, next slide, I was driving near Onondaga. I saw a patch of those flowers and parked my car at the ramp or not. I could get a ticket probably, so don't do that. And then I found bees foraging on the white one. This is actually two species in Michigan. One is a cutleaf teasel, usually with white flowers. Some had a little bit purplish tint. On the left side is a white teasel, which is actually more rare. That one I took a picture of right near Costco in Alchemist, a smaller patch. But I found large patches of the white flowers, the cutleaf one. The difference is the leaves have much deeper cuts for the cutleaf one. For the left one, instead of on the leaves are oval and no cuts. So that's the difference between the two species. I saw more bees on the white one, but maybe because of larger patches. And bees are mostly foraging for nectar, even though they have tons of pollen. Star thistles are blooming. I thought it was too early for them, but I saw patches for them. I got some good photos of bees foraging purple loosestrife. I thought I had photos again, but probably not very good. So on the way to the honey festival, I parked my car when I saw a larger patch, but it's diminishing this plant. I think the biocontrol for the purple loosestrife is quite successful compared to star thistle. I still saw large patches when I drove to the honey festival, but the purple loosestrife smaller patches compared to 20 years ago, much smaller. But bees do love the plant, and they have this strange colored pollen, bluish, or I think it's bluish. Sometimes I don't think it's green, maybe greenish tint, blue, blue-green mixed together, but it's kind of weird color for the red color. The flower is totally purplish red, but the pollen is very different color. So it's kind of interesting. Next one. And then yesterday I saw bees foraging on the porcelain berries. So I come home, brought my ladder because the vines are so tall on the tree. I was eaten alive by mosquitoes with my shorts standing on a ladder. And turned out to be the same species. I thought it's a different species. There was two species. One was the leaves are totally cut, almost palmate. So this one is Brevipedunculata. It's a mouthful. With leaves, smaller cuts, not entirely separate leaves. The other species in Michigan have deeper cuts. It's a different species. But the ones I took yesterday is the same as this one, which I took from Tollgate. They have a large patch there. I took a couple of years ago. So I think that's my last slide. So if you go to my website, bees.msu.edu, I blogged 2 new plants. That's a teasel and also, what's the other one? Teasel and another plant which bloomed earlier in May. I didn't write about. So thank you.
Thanks, Zach. I'll also mention or ask you, Dan, too, since you're about to present, what plant you saw in bloom on July 18th.
So
Your
I
campus.
saw some goldenrod in bloom. I don't know all the species of goldenrod to tell you which one it is, but that's usually something I look for starting August 5th to 10th. This was in Okemos, right close to campus. So that was a little eye-opening about what kind of summer, fall timing might be for nectar flows. But anyways,
Yeah, I
that
did.
was the first.
I also saw a single one. I thought it was unusual. I think it's canadensis, the regular goldenrod in the Dow Gardens. I said, wow, that's way too early, and it was blooming. But it's a single one, so most of them are 99% are still leafy stage.
Megan, do you have anything to add about goldenrod?
Say there is a early goldenrod, and it's called its common name is early goldenrod, and it's Solidago Junica juncia. And so I couldn't tell from the photo if it was that, and that has bloomed in July before. So it
Wow.
could be doomsday or it could be the early version.
So it's canadensis, but a different variety.
It's a Solidago, but a different variety. Yeah. Not the canadensis. The canadensis blooms later.
Oh, okay. I thought you said
Yeah.
it's canadensis, yeah.
All right. Next, Dan is going to talk about robbing.
Yeah, so just going to talk about, seasonally appropriate topic on the theme of this year being strange and timing being off and whatnot. I actually had bees robbing in mid-June, which I've not had to deal with before. They've been pretty good recently, but it's one of those could start back up. So if you're a new beekeeper, just a little bit like what is robbing? It's essentially a feeding frenzy. where hives end up picking on each other. If there's a weak hive in your apiary, generally the strong, when there's an absence of nectar on the landscape and you have large colonies, they're going to try to steal from each other. If there's a weak colony that's susceptible, or a colony with a lot of gaps in the woodware, a lot of entrances that bees can get in, so therefore a lot of spaces that the colony has to defend, and it's not a particularly strong colony, it could be susceptible to robbing. But this is something that typically I think of once we get into summer dearth, which, in a typical year, late July into August can be fairly common. There's periods of dearth where I'm at in Ingham, Clinton counties. And so it's honeybees robbing from other colonies, but also I kind of lump in with robbing yellow jackets. So you see this picture on the right, that's just zoomed in on the landing board, but you see several yellow jackets there. They're looking for an easy meal as well. And you see bees, if you really kind of look at what's going on there's bees wrestling with each other. I mean, that's really the guard bees trying to defend their hive from all these honeybees that are coming in from a different colony trying to steal their food as resources on the landscape get more scarce. So when it comes to preventing or reducing robbing, it's one of those, you can go to the next slide, please. As you get into robbing time of year, again, which we're kind of entering into as we're in midsummer here, it's really important that you kind of work with a plan. You kind of don't want to get out there and open up hives and then say, oh, let me go walk back and get some gear out of the garage and this and that. You want to know what you're intending to do when you inspect that hive, whether it's harvesting honey, it's adding supers, it's queen checking, it's mite washing, whatever you think you might need to do. You kind of want to have your plan in your head and your equipment on hand, so that you can be efficient when you go into that hive. Something that can be really helpful is having extra lids. So for example, today I was in a bee yard for a couple hours. I knew I was going to be, and when I loaded up, I had to put some supers on the truck that have been extracted. So I've got wet supers with, a little bit of residual honey on them. And I stacked those between two telescoping covers. So they're bee tight, because I know I'm going to be parked in a yard and I'm going to need these, but I can't use them in the first 2 minutes I'm in the yard. I'm going to need them over the course of the work I do there. So, when I loaded up, I covered those so I wouldn't pull into that yard and all of a sudden the bees are looking around, because while they will rob equipment on your truck, that once they get started robbing and you drive away, then they'll start looking to pick on each other. So they kind of get wound up into this excited state. Colonies get robbing, and they'll start probing any available place for an easy meal. And if you've got some small colonies in your yard, maybe something's, struggling, or you made up some late nukes or something, you've got small colonies, they're going to struggle to defend themselves. So if you can be kind of planning and prepared to prevent robbing as much as possible. Again, just working quickly and efficiently when you're in your hives. This is not the time to have a hive open for half an hour doing show and tell. Get in, see what you need to see, and close it up and move along. Working to minimize any sort of spilled honey or syrup once you start feeding. And again, having when you're breaking down your hive, if you're stacking supers off to get down to the brood nest, if you stack those supers onto the upturned lid of that hive, so any drips end up on the lid, and then when you reassemble the hive, that's back on the interior of the hive, rather than sitting it on the hive next door and having a bunch of honey drip on the lid, and all of a sudden you've got sticky, the bees find it, again, they get going, they get moved up. So kind of just general cleanliness when it comes to working through the yard. And then also something, if I'm really concerned about it, one thing you could kind of use to your advantage is the time of day. So if you go out and you've got to do something that might stir the bees up and it is a robby time of year, I typically like to do that at the end of the day, right at the last flying hours of the day, because if you do get a robbing frenzy going, the sunset's going to shut that down. If you get a robbing frenzy going at 9 in the morning, it's very hard to stop that. So sort of that evening twilight, if you're really concerned, you know, that can be a little bit helpful, that at least if you do get something going, that will kind of help to put the brakes on it. The next slide's got a couple things that can help you, again, especially if you've got small colonies, or colonies that you're concerned about. So this picture on the left, there are commercially available robbing screens. What that is it fits on, this is on an 8-frame hive, but they make 10-frame versions as well. And because we have this potential in the summer, we do want to be careful about closing down the hive's ventilation. We want that hive to be able to, you know, circulate air as needed so they don't overheat. They're also maybe trying to dry honey and things like that. So we don't really want to limit airflow, but we want to shrink up that defendable space. So what this robbing screen is, it fits on the front of the colonies, you can see there, and it's got a mesh screen that is bumped out. It's not flush with the hive, but so you've got that good airflow out the entrance. And then in the bottom left of that, where you see those little holes, those are like single bee-size entrances. So what is there, 5 or 6 of them there? But you've got these small spaces that are much easier to defend than a broad, wide open entrance. And you haven't compromised that hive's ability to ventilate and thermoregulate, but you've made it a lot easier to defend itself. So that's one option. Another option is just a simple entrance reducer. Most of them that you purchase out there have 2 sizes available, or they're cut so they have 2 entrance sizes available. So if you see in this one that's top right here in the bottom of this red box, usually they have like a 3/4 or a 1-inch setting, which is open. You see a few bees coming and go, but basically that's like 2 bees wide. That's a tiny little entrance. And then if we were to rotate that entrance reducer 90 degrees forward to us, we see the way it's cut, it's got like a 3 or 4-inch gap there. So it gives you a couple different options. And again, you do want to be mindful if you're using that. That is solid. They're not going to be able to move air through that. So you do want to be mindful of the ventilation. Another thing you could use is grass or vegetation, whatever you find on hand. It could be a piece of burlap or something, but just wedging it in the entrance, especially if you didn't plan on getting into robbing, all of a sudden you find yourself in the middle of it, you kind of go with what's available and just close that entrance down. Obviously, you don't want to choke it off completely. You just want to minimize that defendable space so the colony can kind of, doesn't get overrun and you don't start seeing fighting and scrapping on the landing board like in that first photo. So those are some ways you can kind of prevent or mitigate robbing. When it comes to, I guess sort of after the fact, post-mortem, and looking at a colony, one of the real telltales that a colony has been robbed is like this picture on the left. You see most of that picture, the comb has a really jagged look to it. And that's because it was robbed out. Bees and or yellow jackets came in, and again, kind of in a frenzy, they chew the capping off, they take as much honey as they get, and they can leave. It's not in a organized, controlled fashion. So we see this picture, kind of this chaotic remnants of the comb left behind. That's very different than if a colony starved. Like this picture on the right, often we see a starved colony with the heads down in cells. So both of these cases, if you were to come upon a dead colony, you're thinking, oh, there's no food here. If you see it's been robbed out, that's an indication. If you see it's starved, that's an indication it didn't get robbed, it ran out of food. If it's been robbed out, then you can kind of get further into the context of what you're seeing in the other combs to, did it die before it was robbed? Was it after the fact? Do you have brood and things like that? And kind of look at your notes for colony histories and clues. But that's, distinguishing between robbing and starvation and a colony with no food can be helpful as you kind of learn to diagnose what happened. And then just the last photos we have here of the bottom board. And again, that's just showing a comparison. If a colony gets robbed out, typically it was weak. Strong colonies generally don't get robbed, even if there's kind of the yard gets wound up. They're pretty well able to defend themselves. But when a colony gets weak and dwindles, it can be susceptible to robbing. And what you'll see if you come upon this colony after the fact is you'll see on your bottom board a lot of wax flakes. And again, that's those cappings that have just kind of frantically been chewed off in the feeding frenzy. And you'll see a few dead bees because again, they're going to be tussling with the robbers. This wasn't a strong colony to begin with. So you're not going to see, you know, thousands upon thousands of dead bees. Typically, you'll see this, I call it robbing flake. It's kind of these cappings on the floor with a few dead bees versus on the right, when a colony starves, you just see all of the bees die in a matter of, I don't know if it's a few hours or a day, but it's all at once, very sudden. And so you don't get this like robbing flake and you get a whole lot of bees. If you were to look up in the brood nest, you would likely see some brood. That colony was humming along and it just ran out of food stores. So it died. So being able to kind of tell the difference in a post-mortem, you know, exam can just help you kind of learn from your mistakes and you know, prevent them in the future. So that's a bit about robbing as particularly as we get into this later summer, and Zachary talked about all the stuff that was blooming, but you know, it's quite common in the late summer to have a robbing period in a lot of the state.
Great. So I've been getting questions about when we're going to start talking about winter. So people, it's July and people are already thinking about winter. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we want to be setting our hives up now so that they are configured in a good way for winter. So we share this photo a lot, but we like to remind people to ideally keep your boxes and your hives separate. So any boxes that are used for the colony year round are going to be our brood boxes. And then the additional boxes we use to collect honey for human consumption are our honey supers, and we keep those separate. We like to not use the boxes that are for the colony, so the brood boxes, as honey supers. So that's just part of the way that we try to keep our honey boxes really clean. And so when we're thinking about winter, we're thinking about which boxes are going to be left in for the colony for the winter. So in Michigan, I'll say it's pretty common for beekeepers to winter in about 2 deep boxes or the equivalent in mediums. The Minnesota lab has a method or configuration where they teach 3 deeps. And so that means you're going to be leaving extra honey on the hive in most cases for winter, but that can be a good solution if you're in an area with really cold winters or if you're really unsure how much honey you need to leave your bees. So it could be 3 deeps or the equivalent in mediums. And then there are beekeepers who winter single deeps or even nukes, and sometimes like 5 frames over 5 frames for nukes. And that can be a little bit trickier or more advanced to get that configuration just right. But it is a common practice, especially in parts of Canada. So one thing we're thinking about right now is resolving all of our queen issues, right? So if we have colonies that have queen issues or that have gone laying workers, we can do a newspaper combination to combine those colonies. So in this example here, we have the box that's green would have a queen in it with some brood and a healthy queen right colony. And then the box on the top, which is white, would maybe be laying workers or some other queen issue, or maybe some other colony that maybe a beekeeper made some splits that were small and they were just too small and they're not they don't have enough bees. So you could do a newspaper combination in these situations as long as you're not combining sick colonies. We really don't want to spread disease from one colony to another. So as long as we're not worried about some kind of disease, we can use newspaper to combine colonies. And so normally I just use a single sheet of newspaper in between the boxes. It is really good to give the box on top an upper entrance so that we don't accidentally have the box on top overheat, especially when it's really hot. And what the newspaper does is it allows the colonies to get used to each other's scent. So each colony kind of has its own scent. But as they're cleaning out the newspaper, the bees get used to each other. They clean out the newspaper just fine, and it's an easy, clean way to do a combination for 2 colonies. So here's an example of what it looks like when the bees are cleaning out that newspaper. And then they really do clean it all out. So you'll see the newspaper around the edges, but the bees will clean out the newspaper. So this is an easy way to combine colonies if you're having any kind of issue. Again, as long as it's not related to disease. So if we're thinking about how our bees are going to cluster in the winter, they're normally going to, get really close together. They often start clustering lower in the hive and then kind of work their way up, and they're consuming honey. So we want to think about how the bees naturally organize their food stores and try to follow their lead. So sometimes beekeepers are in situations where they're trying to get comb drawn, so they're checkerboarding or they're putting foundation kind of next to the brood nest. If the bees aren't drawing that out, you can start working that foundation towards the edge. You don't want to have a situation where in the winter, the bees are trying to find food in a cold temperature and they're just finding empty foundation or empty comb. So if you've moved frames around this year to try to get them drawn out or or if the top box isn't fully drawn, you can start trying to arrange the frames so that the bees have combs and honey where it would make sense. And then another thing to think about this time of year is that we really want to avoid doing reversals. So one thing is that in most cases for swarm colonies, this time of year are reversal. So reversing those hive bodies can break up the brood nest. And then we also are going to, again, follow the colony's leads and keep the honey on top of the hive, so above the brood nest and to the sides of the brood nest this time of year. So we are seeing in some places that the bees are slowing down on drawing comb. So this can be stuff that you keep in mind as you're arranging frames for the fall. All right, and now Megan is going to talk about winter bees.
Yes. And that was the perfect lead in. So this is the time of year that we're like, even though it's unbelievably hot, that we are actually thinking about winter. And one of the class questions that I just asked my students this year is, what time of year do beekeepers consider like the beginning of the bee year? And a lot of them, including like Beeculture, used to do a thing is like the 1st of August, they would say like Happy New Year. And really what is happening is that your bees are going to start producing the generation that is going to live through the entire winter. And so, even though we do these talks every month, I still hold that beekeeping is very easy because there's only 2 things that are required for bees to get through the winter. So if you want to click to the first one, which is honey. So you have to have lots of food in the colony. So Anna just described how to set up. And then the second thing is lots of winter bees. If you have a hive that has a large amount of healthy winter bees and it has enough honey, there is a very good chance that it will survive the winter. However, it's not just a colony that has a lot of bees. I said 2 things there. I said healthy bees and winter bees. So they have to be healthy in that they have to be completely free of parasites or effectively free of parasites and viruses. And they have to be raised in an environment that's free of parasites and viruses. And then if you want to click on the next slide, you can go through. So they'll be born very soon. We don't have the exact data of exactly when they're going to be born. We do know that it differs based on the age of the queen. So whether or not you have a young queen or an old queen, there are some genetic differences, and there seem to be differences depending on the amount of bees that you have and how healthy they are. But effectively, when pollen stops coming in, that's one of the cues for them. And I was actually just I'm doing an experiment with some USDA researchers looking at different strains, and this is down in Louisiana, and we have 2 strains we're using for this study, and one of the strains completely kicked out all the drones already because they had a mild pollen dearth and the other didn't. So you can have huge genetic differences of when they start getting ready for winter. But effectively, once the pollen starts to slow down, they'll start to raise this generation of winter bees. And again, we want to have the hives be completely parasite free before they're being born. Next slide. And that's because they are completely a different caste. So we talk about castes in beekeeping as being, or in anything, as being a group of bees that are physically distinct and they are physiologically distinct. They form different behaviors. And winter bees, they are worker bees, but they are physically different and they form different behaviors. So in the summertime, you have bees that they go through life where they're nurse bees, house bees, and they kind of die as foragers. And that's really only half the year that our bees act like that. And then in the winter, we have a generation of bees that lives the entire winter, or basically the entire winter. And they are nurse bees at the very end of their lives. So they start out doing thermoregulation, care for the queen, just bead inside the hive in the cluster in the wintertime, maybe doing some housework. And then at the end of their lives, they're nurse bees. So their bodies have to be totally different in order to account for that totally different lifestyle. And the main difference is where they store their energy. So a nurse bee in the summer is going to be very young, and she's going to be tasked with producing a very high fat, high protein diet from her body, which takes a boatload of energy. But she does that when she's really young. A winter bee is going to do that when she's really old. Next slide. And so the main, so the main difference between them is this photo. These are abdomens of a summer worker and a winter worker. So the summer worker is on the left and the winter worker is on the right. And the white difference that you can see in the winter worker is the fat bodies. And the fat bodies perform a few functions. They create vitellogenin, which is a very important protein. They kind of act like a liver, so they do a little detoxifying. But the main thing for the nurse bees is this is a huge energy storage. So a lot of times we'll have beekeepers that'll have these huge colonies over the summer. They're big, they look fantastic, the brood looks great, and they've got this really big brood nest all summer long. So they've got these really big colonies. Well, it's all big colonies of summer bees. And then all of a sudden the weather turns cold and their colony dies and they're just amazed. And what happens is that the varroa mites are in the hive underneath those cappings and predating on the fat bodies of these winter bees. And so you may have a huge population of summer bees, but that literally means nothing in terms of winter survival unless you can allow for the development of these gorgeous winter bees with their lovely fat bodies that will allow them to be nurses at the end of life. So what we want to do is make sure that we do all of our varroa management and have it taken care of so that these winter bees can be formed and these beautiful fat bodies can be preserved.
Thanks, Megan. All right, so next we want to talk about varroa, because we talk about varroa all the time. I was just out monitoring some of our MSU colonies with some of Megan's veterinary students, and we are finding varroa mites, so they're on my mind. So the veterinary students were just learning about all of the resources that are available to beekeepers for monitoring and managing varroa. Again, some highlights are being able to understand what it looks like to lose a colony from varroa mites. And normally when we hear of colonies dying in Michigan, we're going to expect that varroa mites play some kind of factor unless something else is going on. So colonies can starve, as Dan was talking about earlier, but a lot of our colony losses we attribute to varroa mites and the viruses that they spread. So we are monitoring colonies for varroa mites. Today we're using the alcohol wash. I mean, there's good videos online about how to get a sample of 300 bees and put them in isopropyl alcohol to dislodge the mites and see how many mites are in that sample. And then we're also thinking about our treatment options. And so in many of our colonies on campus right now, we have a lot of sealed brood and honey supers on. So we're really looking to formic acid treatments because that is a treatment that we can use when honey supers are on, and that is effective when there's lots of sealed brood in the hive. If there's less sealed brood, we can look at treatments like HopGuard, or if there's no sealed brood, the oxalic acid is an option for us. And then we're also thinking about temperature right now because we want to find temperature windows that are the right for using whatever treatment we're using, especially formic acid. So again, there's the Tools for Varroa Management Guide, which is a free online guide that talks through all the different treatment options for you. And we will be happy to answer your varroa questions in the Q&A. But again, we're trying to monitor. There's lots of good videos if you want to see how to monitor for varroa mites. And thinking about the treatments with honey supers on are going to be formic acid, HopGuard, and oxalic acid. Those are the only treatments labeled for use with honey supers on. All right, so we're about done with our slides here. Once you leave the Zoom, there will be a program evaluation survey that you're welcome to fill out. We always like reading your comments and suggestions. And again, the resources related to tonight's webinar are on this webpage. I'll put the link in the chat in just a second here. And we have lots of funders to thank for supporting our work. All right, so we'll move on now to answering your questions. And it looks like some already put Q&A or questions in the Q&A.
Yes. So, and you can keep them coming. And Zach, I hope you're ready because a bunch of them are for you. The first one is to post a link for the page with Zach's pictures of plants in bloom. Quote, he is an amazing photographer. So I put that in the Q&A. And then I also, I'm just going to put, Zach, I'm putting your bees.msu beetography one, but you can add other ones as well. And on the same topic, Zach, can you recommend any books on North American honey plants and how they rate for bees in regards to both nectar and pollen? And have you compiled photos in a book on plants that are source of resins for propolis?
So it's like several questions.
Yeah, so I guess the first one is I'll give them to you one at a time. Recommendations for books on North American honey plants.
Okay, yeah, so the best book is still not out yet. Dr. George has been working for good 15, 20 years, and he gave all the materials to me, and I probably won't have time to finish it, editing it, and have the finishing touch. Maybe maybe a year or two before I retire, which would be another 3 or 4 years. But there are currently a few small books on honey plants. I bought one. I think it's in my office at the MSU, so I don't have it here. It's a small paperback, was this size? I forgot the name. I think North American Plants for Bees or something. And I think I flipped through it. I don't remember if it has like a attraction to bees, whether produce nectar, pollen. Does it rate that or not? I don't remember. I bought the book 5 or 6 years ago. So yes, so the very first bee book was by Pallet, and that was like 50, 60 years ago. So that's what Professor Georgia is trying to update that book. Is updated. So the other ones that are available are not as comprehensive, smaller books.
Yeah, so there's the Pellet and the Lovell books. We just listened to a talk by Priya Chakrabarty Basu, who wrote the Honeybee Nutrition Guide. And I just found out that she is starting a USDA funded database of not only what plants that honeybees use, but also the nutritional value for them. So we have a lot of information on attractiveness, but we don't have a lot of information on nutrition. And so that's coming out soon, hopefully. All right, Dan, you ready for it? I've had a lot of pest issues, small hive beetle, ants, wax moth. Because of that, I've been going down to the bottom brood box trying to manage for them when I do my inspections. Should I be doing that generally, or is it safe to recommend to leave the first box alone unless it becomes a bigger problem than just spotting these pests?
So I guess I'd be curious on what constitutes a problem, and like, are you seeing them or are they causing problems? And often in my experience in our part of the beekeeping world, these what you mentioned, ants, hive beetles, wax moth, they're all more in like the certainly beetles and wax moth are more of like a scavenger, opportunistic, don't really cause a problem for a strong hive. I see ants a lot on top of inner covers, but they're sort of happily coexisting with the bees until I pop the lid and disturb them. But if you're seeing actual damage where you're getting a lot of like beetle reproduction and lots of beetles in the colony, or you're seeing actual wax moth reproduction, where you're seeing larvae and webbing, that to me is more of an indication of something else that's driving the health issue. Why is that colony that small that it kind of can't defend itself from those opportunistic pests? And so the question was about getting into the bottom box with that in mind? Or
Yes, but I think I kind of gave that to you. So I think they were interested in getting into the bottom box, but I think your main point about them being opportunistic and
yeah,
maybe
again,
that's moot if you.
typically the wax moth and the beetles, they're not really drivers of problems. Again, other parts of the country, they could be more of an issue, but here in Michigan, you know, I see a beetle here and there, no big deal. They're just a reality. And again, the ants, I see lots of ants. I see thriving ant colonies on inner covers in big, robust, beautiful hives. And they don't seem to, I don't think we have any real problematic ant species here in Michigan that really go after the bees or the beekeeper.
Yeah. So the moral of this story is there's something, if you're seeing lots of those pests, if you're seeing a few of them, that's totally fine. If you're seeing a lot of them, it could be because something else is going on. Anna, is there any benefit in feeding pollen now to an established hive?
So what we have seen, at least in our parts of Michigan, is that our colonies tend to bring in a ton of pollen. So there's normally not a need for bringing in or feeding supplemental pollen or protein patties because our colonies already have a lot. And so I would look at your colonies, and if they are storing pollen in the combs, and if you see plenty of pollen coming in, you're probably fine and don't need to worry about feeding supplemental pollen. In other parts of the US, they're more limited in pollen, so they might be feeding right now, but I would think in most cases, it's not necessary unless you're doing something like rearing queens and trying to get a lot of protein on the bees all at once.
Excellent. And there's a follow-up that they are seeing wax moth larvae. So my guess is that their colony is not strong enough to defend the space that it's in.
I was also wondering if I can jump in for that
Yeah.
question, is how much space that colony has. So sometimes if you have your colony in too many boxes, especially if it's small, it's just too much space for them to patrol for pests. So that might be a thought. And another thing I wanted to mention is that, like, I often go to the bottom box to do an inspection because there's brood down there and I want to see what it looks like. So that is a normal part of beekeeping, to check the bottom box.
That's a really good point. We didn't really talk about the bottom box, and sometimes you do go into the bottom box, but it's usually not on pest control because the bees do the best pest control, but that is a good point. Zachary, does the red bee balm, like the home gardener one, attract honeybees like the lilac colored wild bee balms do?
As I have seen, honeybees, a lot of bumblebees coming to the red ones. Yeah.
I also had hummingbirds on mine this week too. So
Hummingbirds love red flowers. Yeah.
hummingbirds love the red ones.
Yeah.
But yes, I have both of them in my yard, and the purple ones especially are just loaded with bees right now.
Yeah.
All right, Anna, I'm going back to you. Preparing for winter, how many frames of bees and how much honey should a hive have by November?
Great question. And like all of our answers, it depends. So part of it's getting that ratio, right? So the right size colony to the amount of honey they need. For most of our colonies that are like a normal size right now, this time of year, strong with making honey, we're going to expect that to be on the safe side, we want to have about 75 pounds of honey in the hive or feed for winter. And for the Upper Peninsula or parts of northern Michigan that have a lot of cold winter, you might even try to get 75 to 100 pounds or more in the hive. So that's really what we're looking at in the fall. right now we're still seeing some bees put out nectar and the supers, and the queens are still laying, so they haven't quite yet reduced their brood nest. So we're seeing lots of bees and not quite as much honey in those brood boxes. So once we are at a point where we are pulling our honey supers, that's normally when we decide if we want to, or if we need to feed syrup to the colony so that they can backfill it and put it in that brood nest area, and so we can get them up to weight. But then again, like I mentioned earlier, another option, if that sounds too confusing, is to leave an extra box on top of the hive full of honey for the bees for winter and dedicate that as a brood box. It means a little bit more heavy lifting for you, but maybe a less risk if you're not sure how much honey to leave on the hive. And then in terms of bees, we saw some good pictures that Megan had in terms of what a cluster of bees looks like in the winter, but really we're not at a point where we have all those winter bees yet. So you want to see, you'll expect to see the colony population decrease from where it is right now.
Excellent. So I'll answer the next one, which is actually our first one coming in. And it says, I have a bee shelter that's like a gazebo, which is over the beehives, but in the rafters, some yellow jackets have established a hive. Any suggestions about getting rid of the yellow jackets without contaminating the bees and honey? So I'm just answering this because it's my second yellow jacket question today. And this is absolutely, I'm like, we are now at the start of the season for yellow jacket questions, which we get a lot of. So one thing is that there's nothing that will kill a yellow jacket, as far as I know, that won't kill a honeybee. But what we can think about is exposure pathways and then also necessity. So the yellow jacket or hornets or wasps, all of those colonies will tend to get bigger over the summer, but they do die off in winter. So it's not like a honeybee colony that's perennial. So if you don't have to kill it, like if you're able to just do your work and you've got your bee suit on and it's not a big deal and your colonies are strong, you maybe just wait it out. And once it freezes, it will go away. Their life cycle is such that only the queens overwinter. And then they start to raise a colony in the spring of workers. And then in the late summer, the colony kind of grows and grows and grows. And then they build a generation of queens and drones that go out and mate. And then all of the males and the workers die and just the queens overwinter again. So it's not like if you have a colony now that every single year, you now have one moved in. But if it is in the way, you would want to kill them in a way that would minimize exposure. So this would probably be something like a spray that breaks down very quickly rather than a powder. So if you have a powder, then if you're comfortable using a pesticide, if you did a powder, there's a concern that the honeybees would become exposed. But pyrethrins, which are the natural insecticide or naturally derived insecticides, tend to break down quite quickly. And so you could look to see if you could find, like within a day, so you could look to see if you could find a pyrethrin braced spray and make sure that it doesn't get anywhere, onto the hives or places that the bees are going to touch, and it should be okay. All right, Zachary, a pollen question. What is bringing in the light, almost white pollen in northern Michigan?
My immediate guess would be corn. Corn pollen is pale, almost white, but that could be other flowers too.
Yeah.
They will forage on, especially early morning, like 6, or before 8 a.m. As soon as the dew is gone, the bees start working on it. But they love corn pollen. I don't know why. It's a wind pollen, not super nutritious, but it's very abundant. So these sometimes balance the ease, I guess. The ease of connection versus the nutritional value. So I have pictures of bees foraging for corn pollen, or even rice pollen in China. Again, that's a wind flower. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the other things that Priya talked about that they're working on is a pollen library based off of the Pantone color codes. So they were actually buying that reel of, color slides and giving every plant the color codes for it, which I thought was very, very clever. So, but there are quite a few that are in the white range right now. All right. So, Anna, there's a varroa question. What is the recommendation for varroa mite treatments when the temperatures are consistently above 80 degrees?
Sure. So for Formic Pro, it recommends using it when the daytime highs are between 50 and 85, especially the first 3 days of treatment. So you have a little wiggle room there. If you're in a part of the country where it's just really hot all the time and you don't get those 50 to 85 windows, you could look at other treatments. HopGuard, for example, says the daytime temperature should be about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's maybe an option for you in warmer temperatures. Or if you have honey supers on, you're limited to formic acid, HopGuard, or oxalic acid.
Mhm. And then on that, there is a question. Oh, I just lost it. Have you done any studies on the OA pads to see if it kept mites at the same level from spring till honey pull? And I'll do that one because I have done studies on the OA pads. So last summer we ran a field trial looking at Varoxan, which is a new version of oxalic acid on a pad, or it's actually in these cardboard strips that should be available in the US in August, I believe. It's already approved federally for use, and it's just going through the approval at all the different states. And then we compared that to the OA pads that Randy Oliver's been talking about on the internet and that a lot of people use. And then we compared it to Formic as our control. And we did it all summer long. So we looked at it from June through August. And we did find that the Varoxan worked quite well through that period in keeping the mites quite low. But then the ones that we made up ourselves, we had two different versions of the oxalic acid in glycerin on Swedish towels. And one of them did not work at all. The other one that was more closely aligned to the ones that most people use did work in some cases, but it was pretty inconsistent. So the average was good, but there was higher variability. And I've talked to quite a few other people that have had that same experience. And I think a lot of it has to do with, if you're mixing something up by yourself at home, not only are there dangers associated with that, but it's just not going to be a consistent product. And if you've tried it, like we've done it a few years in a row, and you can see that like some pads have lots of crystals, some don't at all. And so you do get a really inconsistent result. So I'm very excited to have a legal and effective and consistent method that will be available, hopefully in the near future. There is another question, Dan. So they're saying, I'm seeing earwigs in the hives. Are they a problem to bees?
No, not that I'm aware of. I see earwigs as well. Again, commonly on inner covers. Just something they do. I don't really know what their ecological role is, but they don't seem to bother the bees.
They're mostly scavengers, so whatever dead, probably work on dead bees and stuff, but they won't attack live bees as far as I know.
We did get a really beautiful photo of a praying mantis eating a bee yesterday, which, I mean, it's one at a time, so I don't think she's doing a lot of damage. But Joe, the worker that's working with the USDA, has some like stunning photos of it just like chewing its head off. All right. Zachary, is sweet corn pollen poisonous to bees?
Sweet corn?
Yeah.
No, it's not poisonous. It's probably not ideal. It's pollen is protein content because it's wind pollen. It's probably not ideal. So it's definitely not poisonous. Even the BT pollen I tested many years ago, we tested on honeybees, and the genetically modified that has a gene, the BT gene that's targeting Lepidopterans, like cone rootworm and stuff. No, cone rootworm was a beetle. What I don't remember what they're targeting. Maybe it's targeting cone rootworm, but we tested against the wax moth larva, actually kills wax moth larva too, but it doesn't do any harm to bees, to honeybees.
And we actually did a study, Thomas Woods, the lead author, and found in colonies that we were looking at in egg areas, sometimes they had like 20% of incoming pollen was corn pollen, and they were doing just fine. So.
Yeah.
Anna, how does a brood break help with the mites? Can it even help without doing an OA treatment during the brood break?
Sure. So my understanding is that it is something that can have some effect on the controlling the varroa mites, but normally not enough by itself. So if you have a period where there's a brood break, you also have a period where there's not sealed brood in the hive. So the varroa mites that are looking for cells to reproduce in don't have that option. So it can kind of delay the overall growth of that varroa mite population.
Yeah,
Excellent.
anytime you requeen, you make a split, you slow down the mites a little bit. The Germans did a lot of study trying to determine, they actually quantify the mite numbers by making a split or requeening and stuff like that. There's an impact of slowing down just because of lack of reproductive hosts. So I have a write-up on, if you Google for varroa mite reproductive biology, you should find my article that talks about different factors affect mite having babies.
All right. So there's a plant one I'll do. It says well, I'll start it and then other people can chip in. So if my hive is surrounded by a farm field, what harvestable crop should I encourage the farmer to plant? It's an 80-acre plot. So when you say encourage the farmer to plant, the one that you should encourage someone to plant is the one that they can actually make money off of to support their thing. So there are plants that are harvestable that bees can work. The big one that I can think of, canola, but we don't have a canola factory in Michigan, and so it's not a big crop here. And most farmers are incredibly limited with profit margins. And what we don't want to do is come in and try to tell people how to run their other businesses. So that's if they're someone who's actually trying to make money off of their fields. However, if you have somebody that does have some financial flexibility and is willing to just listen to what their neighbors have to say on how they should take care of their land, there are some options. And I can say this with experience. So I live in farm country and on egg land, and I've been able to work with local farmers who have cropland that's not as profitable in turning that into pollinator habitat. And I've done that through grants, especially through the Farm Service Agency and the NRCS. So those are USDA grants that are done at the county level. And one option that you can do is if they do not necessarily need the income from that land, but they don't want to just have it and not pay taxes on and pay taxes on it, is you can work with the Farm Service Agency and you can actually be the person who receives the grant and does all the work to put it into pollinator habitat or to cover crop or things like that. So like I said, canola, if you could get them to grow clover for seed, that would be lovely. But it has to be something that really is going to go to seed because you want the flowers there. And it's pretty hard to find plants that people are making profits off of for that. But otherwise, you have options of putting it, or you can talk to them depending what they're planting, if they can put a cover crop in. So for example, buckwheat, if they've got something that comes off there. So Dan, have you ever used a wet sheet over a hive in an emergency situation that's experiencing robbing? How long would you keep it on?
So I actually did do this. I'd heard about it for years and years and years, and I had a hive getting picked on at home. And I draped an old towel, damp towel over it, just over the front, so it kind of covered the entrance, not bee tight. And I just left it on until the next, I don't know, this is some point in the afternoon, and I just took it off the next morning. And it did seem to work. Like the robbers, it was confused enough that the entrance was harder to find. It didn't look like what they had visually keyed on before I put the towel over it. So it did seem to, stop the immediate problem. And then that hive put an entrance reducer in that hive, and it was fine. We built it up for winter, and it was okay. So.
Excellent. Do bees work soybean blossoms? Anna, I think you know that one.
Yeah, so this is another promotion for Dr. Reed Johnson talk at the Center of Michigan Beekeepers Association's meeting in August, because he's doing a lot of work on this topic. But my understanding is that the honeybees can collect nectar from soybeans, but it depends maybe on the varieties of the soybeans and how much nectar they're putting out. I guess it's pretty hard to see honeybees on soybean blossom just because of the way those blossoms are. So Dr. Reed Johnson's actually looking at maybe using audio to hear the honeybees visiting the flowers instead of looking for them visually. But this is a potential nectar source. I know there are some beekeepers who are seeking out yards that are close to soybean fields because sometimes the bees can collect some nectar from it.
Excellent. And then, so there's a question about winter bees, and it says, in northern states, when are most of the workers winter bees? And I am participating in a study for this with Gloria Grandy Hoffman at the Tucson Bee Lab. And we are collecting bees every month, and then we send them down there, and then they look at which one, like what the fat bodies are in them. However, we have only done that 1 year, which was last year. And if anyone remembers last fall, it was beach weather into November. And so we have 1 year of data, and it really doesn't feel kind of representative. And honestly, it's hard to know. You can't look at the bees from the outside and tell which ones are winter bees and which ones aren't. But by the time there's no brood left in the hive, which is usually October in most parts of Michigan, or November, then they basically you'll know they'll all be winter bees at that part. Dan, I need to look at a new location for another yard. How far away should I target from my home yards for a new spot?
I think a mile is a good starting point. Again, assuming you're not a commercial operation running yards of 24 to 30 plus colonies. If you run a bee yard that's got 8 or 10 or 12, I think a mile down the road is totally fine. Yeah, that's.
Yep. All right. I'm going to start with this one because I feel passionately about it, but other people's can chip in. I had 2 hives that ended up with laying workers. Could I have put a frame of brood from another hive into those hives to prevent the laying workers? I was waiting for the mated queen to return and evidently waited too long and got laying workers. I read somewhere that a new queen won't lay if there's brood in the hive. Is this correct? So we did a lot of walkaway splits this year, and I raised a lot of queens. And you do end up with colonies that are laying workers when you have requeening, whether you do it or whether you just leave the bees alone to do it. When you add a frame of brood, so the laying worker is a physiological change. Their ovaries are activated in the absence of a queen, and then more importantly, in the absence of brood. And so, yes, if you do put a frame of brood in there, it would stop them from being laying workers. However, in my opinion, that's not the fix, because once a colony is laying workers, it is genetically dead. They cannot come back from it, and it's very far away from being a really good, happy, healthy colony. So my recommendation, or what I do when I have laying workers, is if it's a big laying worker hive, what you want to think about it, it's not a colony because it doesn't have all those beautiful interactive demographics. You know, you don't have your queen, your larva, your nurse bees. You don't have all of those generations. You just have a box of really old workers. And so if I have a box of really old workers, I think about who I can combine it, who could use a box of really old workers or who can use a boost. And what I'll generally do is what Anna showed is do a newspaper combine and just add it onto another hive. And then if I want to have two hives or I'll make a proper appropriate split at another point instead of trying to like bring this zombie back from the dead. So I give them a chance to requeen. If they don't requeen on the first try, I'll just either newspaper combine them, or if they're really small, I'll just shake the hive onto the ground and we move on with life. I never try to get a laying worker colony back on track. I don't know if Anna or Dan feel differently on that.
No.
All right. And then this one, I don't know. So either Zachary or Anna or Dan, if you want to chime in, that certain varieties of buckwheat produce more honey than other varieties. Any suggestions? All I know about buckwheat is I don't really like the honey, but the bees really like it. It has a really short growing season, so it's great. And the bees only work it in the morning, but I don't know anything about varieties.
I don't either.
I don't know which ones are more productive either. I
All
only
right.
know it's Harry Climbs put some near a reserve, and I visited that site 1 year. I noticed the ones had 9 or 10 supers or one colonies. It was so productive. But some people saw them at a premium because
Yeah.
some people like they dark and and spicy, as some call it stinky. And like Germans love it. You you export the buckwheat honey to them. So
Yes, I definitely know people who love it, love it, love it. And it does sell really well, and you can make a boatload of honey off of it.
yeah.
And it's a great cover crop. We've used it at MSU. All right, so there are no more open questions. I think it's great that everyone came out tonight on their Monday night, and we look forward to talking to you at further office hours.
There was one question Megan
Oh,
mentioned, but I was lost in details. There was one person asked me if I compiled photos of propolis.
oh yeah, propolis and resin. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, I do have photos of bees collecting propolis, but only from a few flowers. I have photos and video of bees collecting from just a regular poplar trees in China, the tree on the leaves, young buds. There was one strange Hawaiian plant, huge white flowers, and I was trying to observe why bees were working on it, and I decided it was collecting resins on that flower. And I've seen bees in Turkey collecting just a pine resin oozing out from pine tree. So those are the only three plants, but it's in Michigan. I don't really know. I have to say poplar at least, but I don't know what other pine trees. But I don't know what other trees are working on it. But
Yeah.
In China, they have studies of using uh, GCMS or DNA barcodes maybe to determine the plant source, but that's not really studied here in North America. So yeah, we don't know.
So it sounds like we are all going to eagerly await your coffee table book with your bee photos of them all collecting on there, I think is the moral of the story. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.